Good evening and welcome. My name is Mary Ann Vernetson and I am the Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service here at UF. We are thrilled to host you here tonight and excited to have the opportunity to share this great lineup of experts in anthropology, arts, and placemaking. For those joining us remotely, thank you for tuning in. Tonight's program is more than a year in the making and was inspired by the work of Dr. Cady Gonzalez. When I first met Cady, she was entering her final semester of graduate school. She had been awarded one of the final Bob Graham Center doctoral dissertation completion fellowships for her research into how the government of Ethiopia uses practices of hospitality to clean its rapidly urbanizing capital city. As someone who had worked and lived in an urban environment for almost 20 years, I was immediately intrigued by her project. Cady's commitment to civic engagement and public service are evident in her work and in the intentional way she has built tonight's program. As a result of this, you will have the chance tonight to hear from three individuals who share a commitment to addressing environmental and social issues from interdisciplinary perspectives. Our speakers, Stowe Lynn, Dr. Cady Gonzalez, and Sherry Dobbin will discuss how programs of city beautification and practices of hospitality can enrich our cultural fabric and nurture a sense of belonging in our community. The panel is moderated by Dr. Brenda Chalfin, a professor of anthropology, and who also served as the director of the Center for African Studies here at UF for 6 years. Following the panel discussion, we will have a chance for questions from the audience. If you are watching at home, we invite you to use the comment bubble in the lower right-hand part of your screen to submit your question. Now please join me in welcoming tonight's panel.
Thank you everyone for being here and giving your time to this important opportunity to really talk and learn across disciplines and areas of expertise about urban futures. I'm going to introduce briefly our three panelists. Stowe Lynn is an interdisciplinary artist. His recent work has centered on collaborations with abused landscapes and municipal agencies. His work is cross-disciplinary and includes printmaking with polluted waterways, 3D scanning in Freshkills landfill, recycling waste into art materials, and hosting performances at Superfund sites. He's been a public artist in residence at the New York City Department of Sanitation, and he was the first artist in residence in the Alexandria, Virginia Renew wastewater treatment facility. Len is now based in Queens, New York. He has familial roots in Virginia and Vietnam, and his work incorporates these bonds, linking their history, environment, traditions, and politics. Sherry Dobbin is a cultural and placemaking advisor in London. She heads the SRD Culture Ltd. Her firm offers strategic guidance on cultural infrastructure and arts programming for urban development and regeneration. She integrates commercial, civil, civic, and philanthropic investment and brings more than 35 years of experience to this task. She has expertise in cultural industries globally and she was a partner at the Future City Limited, where she brokered cultural partnerships and events around the world. Earlier, as director of the Times Square Alliance in New York and a creative director for the Times Square Arts Program, she led groundbreaking projects, including founding the Midnight Moment, which was the world's largest digital exhibition across electronic billboards. And I do hope we get to hear a little bit more about that. Cady Gonzalez, as you know, co-organized this event with the Graham Center Mary Ann Vernetson. Gonzalez holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Florida and was a Bob Graham dissertation fellow last year in 22-23. She is a Fulbright Hays awardee, and her research focuses on urban design in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And it includes looking at citizen engagement with government programs of cleaning and greening. She's published on hospitality, waste infrastructure, and cultural practices surrounding coffee. Dr. Gonzalez is currently a visiting faculty member at Rollins College, and she also sits on the neighborhood planning board in her hometown of Tampa, Florida. Dr. Gonzalez is going to assume a new position starting in the fall in urban environmental anthropology at the University of Maryland in College Park. So let me begin with a question for everyone, just as a warm-up to get you to share more about your personal, professional, and your intellectual motivations that bring you here. Can you say a few more things about yourself? Why do you want to be here tonight? And really, what do you bring to the table in terms of your experience locally in the US as well as internationally?
Thank you, Brenda and Marianne, for such a generous introduction for all of us. Thank you to the Bob Graham Center for having us here tonight. As both of them mentioned, I co-organized this panel. And so the way that this came about was because I was very much inspired by what I was seeing on the ground as an ethnographer in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I study with sanitation workers, primarily women, who manage public toilets and public parks, and have seen how this smaller project has unfolded over since 2016 into larger urban design, river rehabilitation projects to revitalize a city. So it begged a lot of questions for me about what makes a home, who gets to be included, how do you invite someone in, how do you encourage them to stay, and how do you show welcome? And as I started to talk to people and become more attuned to this, I noticed that art and design was so important, as well as cultural practices of hospitality, into how, what makes a home in a city. And so talking to Marianne as a sounding board, thinking about how art and design and placemaking were so enfolded that we all come to these same questions from different angles. That is why we, at least I think, we sit here as a panel tonight. And that's my motivation for being here, is to really be able to talk to Stolen and Sherry about their amazing work and find those intersections for an ongoing conversation.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's really great to be here. I think, for me, I'm an artist. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. My parents were social workers. I sort of have civic-minded blood in me. I vowed to never be a social worker, but it sort of crept into my artwork regardless of that intention. And as an artist, I moved to New York City, and like a lot of artists, we try to get shows in galleries and museums, and I was doing all of those things. But I think over time, I started to feel like the art world was such a bubble, and it can be a great bubble, but it's certainly a bubble. And I always, sort of wondered how to get art more into the world, the rest of the world, and make things accessible, but not compromise my vision or aesthetic or ideas, So over a long period of time, I sort of wrestled with these kinds of ideas and tried lots of things out. And in New York City, I have had the chance to be the resident artist at the sanitation department. And that was a revelatory experience for me. 2 years in the Department of Sanitation, shadowing employees, making work, really in collaboration with the department, was my main impetus. And I think, I just sort of saw the role of arts as being so much more expansive than showing in galleries and museums, but could actually be, inside city agencies, could be internally reflecting what the workforce was doing and be a bridge to the public in a totally unique and different way. So I'm excited to be here because I love being in places I'm usually not supposed to be in, I think. There's a personal joy of being in a place where art, I feel like sometimes is often overlooked. And I really want to bring art to the table in various ways that I just feel like can increase, the visibility of things and make for a better conversation. So thanks for having me.
Hi. Yeah, I started as a practitioner in performing arts, more as a performer and a director and such. And then I started moving into being a manager, a production manager, a stage manager, and then an administrative manager. And then I moved into direction. So then it was starting to actually direct what those concepts were, be a curator, curating other curators and institutions, and out of all of that experience now, what I find is that I have that combination of knowledge that makes me think that it's better to start working with a lot of people and understanding how we can create better structures. A huge motivator for me is, what structure is just enough? How do we, ensure that we leave a design unfinished so that there's room for people to actually come in and make that, but also keep the dynamism of place and also the diversity of individuals that are going to come there and allow them to claim it. And so one thing I have noticed in the various forms of arts, because I worked with a lot of cross-disciplinary artists who are challenging what is a genre, what isn't a genre, how they might work together. And particularly in terms of residency programs, because I've run different residency programs in odd places, I've always had this thought that the role of the artist was more like an anthropologist. But of course, that's my layman's term of what an anthropologist is. So when Marianne said there was this ability to have a discussion between an anthropologist and artist, and then one who's trying to support that work and understand where arts, culture, and the artist relate to our daily life, I thought this would be an intriguing conversation, to be able to share.
Thanks so much. So each of you work in the space of hospitable urbanism. You do so through planning, placemaking, creative practice, and academic research. Can you tell us more about how exactly you work in that space? And more importantly, how do you define the term hospitable? What does it mean to you? How does it manifest in your practice?
Bounce off for a little bit. So I'll go ahead and start by saying, for me, it really captured my attention, right? So I'll start with a short story. I was a graduate student. It was my first time in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I was fresh off a red-eye flight, and I really needed a cup of coffee. If anyone's ever been off a red-eye flight, that's like the first order of business, to stay up for the rest of the day and acclimate. And I took a walk along the street, and I noticed a public Ethiopian coffee ceremony happening on the street. And it looked a lot like this, the photo that's on the screen. Perhaps instead of the woman there kind of over the charcoal stove, she was sitting on a stool, roasting coffee beans, boiling coffee in a jebena, the traditional Ethiopian coffee pot. And so I decided to take a rest and have a cup of coffee. And as I was sitting there, a man next to me asked, well, why are you here? What are you doing? And I told him I was here to do some work. And he goes, yeah, sure, they have coffee here, but you're at a public toilet, right? And so it just had dawned on me that, I was sitting in this very unique space that was this urban enclave. It was this small little urban park with flower boxes, and it was this space in which so many people were gathering and coming together and drinking coffee, and yet there were these toilets just a stone's throw away in these cubicles right there, and this was the sanitation project. So it got me thinking about okay, well, what do you do before you invite people into a home? You often clean up your house, right? And so these cleaning campaigns and thinking about who can be in spaces are very much entwined. And so it got me thinking about, how do you deal with strangers? How do you invite guests in? And who is there at that site of welcome? So I'll leave it at that, and then we can kind of keep talking. Here's the Ethiopian coffee ceremony. It looked like the one more with all the beautiful flowers strewn around.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I love that story, by the way, so much. And it's interesting thinking about hospitable, the word and what that really means in real life. You know, I think when you enter a new place, a new country, a new city, you move to a new town or even a new neighborhood. And I remember when I moved to New York City, which I've been there now for 23 years, I feel like a steward of the city. When people move there, I want to tell them where they can go and great places that will make them feel welcome and you know, hospitable places. I remember when I arrived, though, I was sort of drawn to the inhospitable places. I wanted to go to the waterfront, you know, and it was like really kind of hard to get to the water. And, you know, it made me think a lot about accessibility and how, you know, that's so key to being hospitable in any place, you know, accessible to everybody. And that inspired me to forge ways to make these kinds of spaces in the city more hospitable, you know. And I mean, I did things like have walking tours through places to get people to places and show them how you get to these sites that should be enjoyed by everybody, honestly, you know. But we're sort of seen, underutilized, underfunded by the city. And, you know, I even went so far as to make up my own welcome center. It was totally illegal. It was a shack I built on the side of this waterway called the Newtown Creek. And I called it the Newtown Creek Center for Visual Research. You know, I totally made that up. But what was great was it was like a physical building that people could be invited to. And that's all you really needed. Someone to say, come on down, let me show you how to get here. We can, you know, explore this area. You can learn the history. You can feel welcome here. And all of a sudden, people kept coming back, you know, and that's kind of a beautiful thing. So that's just one small aspect of, hospitality in a place. But I think that's one thing that I've often worked with myself.
Well, yeah, and a lot of it is related to experiential, right? So a lot of the work that I do when it comes to placemaking, wherever I am, is to take a look at, you know, what is the data imprint that says the place is and who the people are, what are the statements that are made about it, you know, what's all that desk-based research where I can understand what resources it has, what cultural ones, what the demographics of the population is, what the work is like, what the industry is like, et cetera. But then there's the physical walking through the city. And so very often what I like to do is have that impression that is just on paper first, what I've been told exists in the city, and then start to understand whether that's actually represented in the city or not. And who's out, who's not out, what is happening, where are people going, where are they not going, why might they not? Even things that seem like they've been a success, I always look for what might be missing. And then in that, it's trying to understand what the obstacles might be about why people aren't going there. And that's what starts to give an indication of what can introduce that sense of welcome. You know, very often it's very popular now. There are slogans everywhere and visions everywhere that say, you know, this is for all, this is for everyone. And a lot of times I think, no, everywhere should just be for anyone. Not everyone is going to want to do the same thing. Not everyone is going to be comforted in the same place. I mean, certainly during COVID, we really learned whether we were introverts or extroverts, for example. So what might make an extrovert comfortable is not necessarily make an introvert comfortable. And so in looking at a city and its spaces, every place can't do everything for everyone all the time. So you start to think, how can you allow those opportunities perhaps to happen throughout the city and in different areas? And then also, I do a lot of work between development, cities, and architects. Landscape architects, and then that always leads into the infrastructure questions. And there's a balance between practical and then also the design desire. But what's really important is what kind of behavior is it going to invite, introduce, allow room for, and leave that space for people to be able to change. Because a lot of times people like to oversimplify, and they'll say, what does the community want? As if there's only one community anywhere. And even within one community, why are you assuming all these individuals have the same interests and comfort levels? And so it's very important to constantly question, what that might be and to leave room for that. People move, People move on, they move to different parts of the city. So if you try and design the answers for everything as if there's one definition of being hospitable, then it will be outdated. So I think there always is that balance between what are hard infrastructure aspects to it and what are the softer ways in which you allow room for the programming to take place. And I think that's what's so wonderful about artists. A lot of these slides right now that are coming up they're all pieces of programming that I've done either in Times Square or other places. And they're there to show you that not everybody looks the same, the aesthetics aren't all the same, the approaches aren't all the same. The idea is that the great thing about artists is that they'll constantly reframe the familiar. And to me, that's such a pleasure. And if you don't have that, your places can be either outdated or inappropriate for who's coming in.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's what you're bringing up here is really important, right? So as an anthropologist, I have all this anthropological theory to think about too when thinking about hospitality and how it's this double-edged sword of welcoming and trespass, but it's also this negotiation, right? And so what you're talking about here is how it's this social practice and process of figuring out how to be adaptable and kind of beginning to just let the life that happens or the place that is created through being there actually be what makes it durable. And yeah, that's very fascinating.
And it can't be too bland. So multi-purpose. If it's too multi-purpose, the space doesn't have enough of an identity to make it interesting. And, Stellan, you can correct me if this is wrong, but usually artists like a little oddity or a quirk or something that's wrong or something that looks like it's missing in order to get their interest going. So this can be a really interesting discussion sometimes, like with landscape architects or architects, where they're like, what are you doing? What are you doing? I'm like, no, please leave a little bit of quirk there. But you can speak to this.
No, it's so true. I mean, I think as an artist, we're actually problem solvers. We love a problem. We love, we do. And not a lot of times people think about artists as being solving anything, but we love looking at weird spaces, that challenge of creating something new out of something mundane. I think that's definitely one of the skills we can bring, to any situation like that. So yeah.
There was this guidance document that I was doing with the Urban Land Institute in London, and the title ended up being, the really sexy title called Including Culture and Development. But originally what I wanted to call it was Give Us Your Problems. Because it was that idea, very often, even in a respectful way, people will want to leave an artist commission and they'll want to set it up so it's so perfect. And I'm like, don't do that. Leave the mess or the problem, because the artist wants to do that. If you make it too perfect, they're going to deconstruct it, problematize it, and then put it back together, right?
We'll make problems. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is not exactly an artistic piece, right? So again, my ethnographic research was at these public toilets that were coupling coffee, which is this cultural symbol of hospitality here, right? It is deeply religious for many. And to put it next to something like toilets or sanitation was going to be transgressive. It was a taboo, right? It was not for everyone. There's a picture floating here, sanitation for all. It was not for all. It was for a very specific, more secular version of a Jabanapuna ceremony, commercialized and such. And, the workers were always going to be women because it was more prescribed, right? To be this kind of infrastructural space. But over time, as like the program kind of broke down because of whatever transgressions or use, or the sanitation department pulling out and the beautification program coming in and such, it was the performance though of that ceremony that was the thing that gave it heart, right? It was the soft kind of infrastructure that you're talking about, not necessarily an artistic performance, but a cultural practice.
Yeah, there are things that are performative, but aren't necessarily formal performing arts, right? And so, like you say, there are rituals, and it might even be this sort of crossing the street or doing something. When there was a project I was working on in a place called Stevenage in the UK, and it was one of the first new towns. So this was post World War II, and the idea was to get people out of tenements in the city and to give them more open space. And the whole town was created, basically. And this is what a new town is. And it had these town center gardens, and then it had some block of flats that were for subsidized housing, and then there was a town center, and everything was starting to deteriorate a bit. And instead of just designing the town center gardens again, we decided to have a couple of series of artist projects for consultation. And one stage was these artists, they did something that, again, when you hear it, it sounds like, oh God. But then when you see it in action, it's great. And they said, well, we just want to put basically a 1-to-1 scale floor plan of one of the flats in those tower buildings, apartments. And we're just going to cut it out in masonite, and we're just going to put it in the park. And I was like, what? Okay, just do it. And they did. And all of these different groups came, and they chose which room they wanted, like the different spaces. And there are two reasons why I tell you this. One favorite moment is when I was down there and I was watching the teenagers were in the front room, in the living room or whatever. And again, this has no walls. It's just completely flat. And then one of them was like, oh, I want to smoke. And so purposely walked off the masonite to go outside so he could smoke, Members of the flats gave pieces of furniture to furnish it and to create this. And then there was this one older gentleman who was walking through the park, and he looked like someone who, let's say the Arts Council in the UK would say, would not be interested in the arts. And he came up to me and he said, God, isn't art great? And I was like, yeah, why do you say that? And he said, I do this walk every day and have done it for 27 years. And today I stopped and said, what is that? And he said, this was the great joy, is that art can just surprise you. And it was a really important moment for me because it made me realize that there is an intellectual sort of fear that conceptual art doesn't relate to people, or people won't get it. But there's no problem whatsoever in understanding it. And these notions and these universal notions are something that anybody can relate to. And from that point forward, it just gave me so much confidence to say, yeah. Ensure that the artist is pushing themselves on what is a good idea. They've thought through it. They know why. And then stand back and give a lot of credit to your audience and your people and allow them to find their space for it. But you don't have to come up with another form of work to happen in the public.
With that, Stowe, would you talk about your Office of Invisibility?
Sure.
Work?
Yeah, sure. Well, when I was at the sanitation department, what was great about this residency was that they said they really entrusted in me time for my process, and this is really crucial for artists. I think the agency basically gave me 4 to 5 months of research time. And they said, we don't want you to know what you're going to make art about. We want you to get to know us first, and this was really an important first step for me to really embed myself in the agency. And that's what I did, and over time, what I kept, sort of hearing from workers was the sense that they felt super unseen, you know, and like, and this is true. It's like, I mean, that's an interesting conundrum because they have high visibility outfits on that are like super reflective. It's the most visible you could possibly be. And they're in a large, giant, you know, loud sanitation truck, and they're picking up your garbage, you know. And yet they were kept telling me over and over, God, you know, I feel like no one really sees me unless they're stuck behind my truck, and then they start honking, you know. And one time I was in the truck, you know, and someone was laying on the horn, and the sanitation worker was like, "You want to get a donut? Let's go." So we left the truck. We went to get coffee and donuts. We came back, you know. It's never honk behind a truck. They're doing a hard job. But so, I mean, with this time I spent with people, you know, I really realized that it's a simple issue of visibility, you know, and just acknowledgement. And so I had to kind of come up with an umbrella name for my project, and you know, kind of using the vernacular of in the sanitation department, they have different bureaus and offices. So I decided to create an office of my own. I call it the Office of Invisibility. You know, kind of in the sense that it was an office of bearing witness, you know, and giving visibility to not only the workers but the labor themselves, and kind of, you know, shining a light on how we're implicated in this relationship, you know. So the Office of Invisibility took many forms. Under that umbrella, I found an old television studio. Believe it or not, sanitation had their own TV studio that they'd sort of forgotten about. And I walk in this room, no one had been in there for decades, and it was full of films and videos. And I was asking people, you know, what is all this stuff? And they're like, it's old stuff. You know, we're probably going to throw it out. I was like, let me inspect it. You know, and I'm pulling out film reels from 1903. It was literally 100 years of media, you know, film, VHS tapes, and they had the machines, you know, to play all this stuff. So I was like, listen, you're not allowed to throw any of this stuff out. Let me take a look at it, you know. So, I mean, this stuff, you know, to them, people on the job, it was invisible to them, you know. And when I started to play this stuff, and I ended up digitizing 500 hours of this footage. And the department they have flat screen TVs in all their facility buildings. So I started to make my own program. You know, I called it the Sanitation Television, SAN TV, Sanitation Art Network Television. And I started making my own, you know, reels for them. And I put myself in it, like, hi, I'm your artist in residence. But then, you know, it's like, look what I digitized this week. And I would make these reels, and they were seeing it. There's 10,000 employees at the department, you know. And so on the screens, which, you know, of course, we all see through the screen now, you know. So this is like a perfect way to communicate to a 10,000 person workforce, was through their own screen with their own history that they hadn't seen, you know, like literally hadn't seen it. And multiple people told me they were going to throw all this stuff out. So I don't know. Well, once that kind of became known, people wanted to come to the Office of Invisibility, and I would show them stuff. You know, people would bring me things that they wanted me to keep or to give visibility to the public. So people were bringing me artifacts, people were bringing me oral history, people were bringing me so much rich material about themselves, you know, in this beautiful way. And for me to be a conduit to that, for me to like help save that stuff, for me to be a bridge to the public was super meaningful. And, you know, the Office of Invisibility now, I'm not technically at the sanitation department, but I feel like this is the kind of thing that can go on and into different agencies, into different places. You know, we always need an Office of Invisibility, probably. So,
Do the two of you think you share similarities in your methodology, or what do you think are similarities in your methodology?
yeah, what do you think?
I am very curious to hear what you say, but I believe that you are, I think you are very ethnographic in your approach, particularly the way that you talk about being very interested in what is both beautiful and horrifying at the same time, and embracing those kinds of complexities, or trying to not ever see anything in black and white, right? Or ethnography, I think, is a very inductive discipline or approach, right? Where we go in, we might have a question or an interest. Clearly, you loved sanitation, right? But you still went in and were like, well, what's important to you?
Yes.
You know, how can I make things more visible for you to amplify voices, to give momentum to this kind of story? And so when I first learned about Stowe from a 2022 article in the New York Times about the trash resident. If you have not read it, it's a great piece. Go read it. But what really struck me was this office of invisibility, specifically. Anthropologist catchphrase is making the invisible visible. And you've just spent so much time with the people that you work with, collaborating, but also with the non-human or more than human substance that you've been working with in the materials and all of their ontologies, that I do feel like we share a method, and yet I write more, you know, and you produce in different ways. But that's how I see.
This has been such a fun week because I'm learning that I'm also an anthropologist. Maybe I could get even more grants now, you know. No, but
We'll co-write.
Oh yeah, see, but we need each other, and this is what it's all about. We all need each other here, you know. And I love hearing you talk about your methods, and I completely can relate to a lot of the way that, you know, you described your working habits, and just sort of how you embed in places and learn from the place, and that's not easy to do, and it takes time, and it takes respect, and it takes you know, a kind of due diligence to do it right, you know, and to do it in a way that's like really holistic. And I think, I don't know, I know a lot of artists like myself, you know, we're maybe a minority, but a lot of us are thinking in these really similar ways. And as image makers, you know, we're not always good writers. And so we really need the written word. And of course, you know, the written word needs the image to go with it, and they both can help tell stories and histories. So, and we need all the opportunities we can get. Sherry,
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. The residency was set up by the city, right, of New York?
Yeah, that was
And
the Department of Cultural Affairs.
What is it that they were looking for, or what did you feed back into the city that helped them? Because I guess some of it is understanding, like, you create all this great work, but why does the city do it, and what is the city getting from it? And what do you think was good about how they set it up, and what do you, or was there any feedback that you gave to them later?
Yeah, they it was great. We were meeting almost weekly to talk about it. So, and I never felt, at one point I was like, I don't know if I have stuff to talk about it, and they were like, this is art therapy. We talk out your art problems, you know. They were really supportive, but at the end of the day, of course, they want some stuff too, you know. Like, and what they want is public engagement, you know. They want public engagement, and they want how I can sort of communicate that, you know. Like, the sanitation department has pretty robust education department. They have a pretty, they have a lot of community outreach, and that does a thing, and that does an important thing, but art can still do something totally different on multiple levels, you know. So they wanted that engagement, but it really could be however I wanted to engage the public with. So, you know, I think at the end of the day, you know, everyone, I think, was happy with what the outcome was, you know. The engagement was normal kind of exhibitions, but there were also interactive online things. There was a video game that you could play about sanitation. There was, you know, a book, and you know, really the most meaningful stuff, kind of, they were like these little moments that happened, you know, between the public and, you know, it's the sanitation workers. I mean, because the Times had written about it, and there was like a sort of a public profile. people would walk up to me like on the subway platform and say, you know, I had this question about recycling. You know, like, can you recycle aluminum foil? This happened to me almost on a daily basis. So I was like a walking info center, which I was happy to do, you know. But yeah, I have to commend the Department of Cultural Affairs for giving me a lot of freedom in the end. And I think it's a great model. And I really, now that I've done it, I really continually advocate for this to happen in every city, you know, and everybody should have an artist in residence if they can, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's one thing that I always struggle with. A lot of commissions, they're so used to dealing with built environment, so they're so used to really, really tight design tenders and such. And I always have to explain that, you know, writing a brief for an artist commission is different than it is in writing a design brief. And, you know, and so one of the things I've always had to think about is the practicality of it. And we were talking about this in some classes this week, that one of the most important things that I always have to do is respect and try and gather all of the fears as well as the aspirations of what people have, to respect them, to understand that. So one thing I discovered really early on, I guess like 20-something years ago when I started doing sort of arts-led regeneration, is people were nervous, like, what are we going to get? What are we going to get? When can we ask the artist something? How am I going to know? How am I going to know? And I realized that their fear was less about what exactly the artist was going to do and more about, how do I know when I can ask? How do I know when I'm going to be able to tell my boss or feed to the public or tell the counselors when they're going to get something? And so the compromise was that I just found the framework was more rigid. You know, there were milestones and there were check-ins, and then everybody relaxed because they were like, okay, I know that I don't have to ask anything from this time to this time, but at this time, it's okay for me to say I want the artist to present where they're going and what they're doing, and then we'll have another check-in point, et cetera. And so that's something that is built in now, whether it's just like one commission or whether it's an entire public art strategy or whether it's an entire cultural plan for a place or a city. I just learned to build in where, you know, if you can't give the certainty of what the output is going to be, you can give some certainty as to what the timeline might be or what the budget is or some parameters of the way in which they work or something to that effect. And so I do spend a lot of time with trying to comfort people, reassure them, also really respect those fears, because a lot of people have jobs where they have a lot of accountability, and you don't, in the desire to be ambitious, you also have to respect those who have to come through with all of those maintenance plans, all of those audits, all of those insurance accountabilities. And that's one of the ways I've found to make more room for the artists, as opposed to getting so locked into what they think the commission should look like.
Another question for you all is about the kinds of trends or approaches you'd like to see in the future, especially around these core urban issues: climate, human and non-human relations, migration, displacement, democracy, public life, so many issues. What kinds of interventions do you kind of envision or foresee or desire?
I do think we really need to be conscious about tolerance, the sort of extremism in any form, you know, racism or sexism or absolutism in any way, is something that we need to be very conscious of right now, globally. Because the more that happens, the more it shrinks possibility, the more it shrinks dialogue, the more it shrinks opportunity to rethink things. And I feel like that is as important as climate change. think those things need to live side by side. So a lot of people talk about, what is the sort of ESG rating? What is the environmental, social, and governance rating? And I think it's really important. And so you have to take care of the place. You have to respect and care for the place, the people, but also how then everybody can live together. And sometimes people can focus on environmental because it seems like it's easier. You can hit targets a little bit more easily. You can set up goals a little more easily. But the social aspect is incredibly important. So the social trends, challenges that face us are crucial. But the governance of how and who gets to and how that can change is incredibly important. So I guess that's probably my sort of fear part. There are aspirations as well, but I pass over to you guys first.
Yeah, I love what you said about the fact that, for me, I've been so steeped in sanitation and waste management, and for years now, I've been in, I've worked in landfills. I've seen firsthand the human imprint that we continually put on the planet and how that, just sort of relates to everything. I mean, it relates to obviously, the dying of, species and the melting of glaciers, but it's right in your backyard too, and the, one thing that was really interesting about learning about sanitation's history was it's linked to civil rights, and how when you really start looking at waste issues, you see that what communities are impacted the most, and it's always poorer communities and communities of color, and so if you want to start talking about climate justice, you have to talk about economic justice. You have to talk about, its connection to, all kinds of biases that are built into our laws and systems, and so those things all need changing. And I think that they all work together, in this way that is, can be overwhelming. Like I get people feeling just so overwhelmed. It's like there's so much work to be done. The climate crisis is totally, it's paralyzing in a way if you try to solve it all at once. But I think because it is so interconnected with so many issues, my hope is that, we can hit it on all these different levels through art, but that's not going to solve all our problems. It's definitely about working together, artists and activists and in our governments as well. But I want more out of all of us. I want us to just work together more. I feel everything feels so divided these days, and I think that there's definitely ways that we can just come together, and based on our interests and based on really local kind of organizing, we can at least start there and kind of look outwards. But art is just one little part of it. But I think for me that happens to be my lane, But I'm really excited to collaborate with placemakers, anthropologists, environmentalists. I think the future is in co-creating the world that we want to see, So.
Just to add on, just to sort of join some of it, one of the things that's great is that because an artist will come in with a process that isn't so linear, it basically sort of breaks the system. What it can do, so the idea of why residencies can be so impactful is because people can get in that mindset if they don't know what to do, like you say about problems, or they only see it as happening one way. And an artist's work potentially can come in and just involve people in rethinking a system. And sometimes it's for something like over here, almost like a distraction or whatever. But from that process of working over there, they have the confidence and the skill set and the ability to then take their mainstream problems and feel like, oh yeah, we could come up with a different way of working. Like it gives a sense of hope. And sometimes that's one of the most important things about creative expression, is it allows you to also like tie to humanity, tie to emotion, try something new, do something because it feels good or it sounds good or whatever it is. It doesn't have to make such intellectual sense or linear sense or literal sense. And, that's why that one little residency or something with 10,000 sanitation workers, plus all of the people involved with it, can really make a difference, possibly to thinking about sanitation problems, just because everybody is loosened up and they're comfortable communicating in a new way and being able to problem solve together.
I echo both your fears and then also the solutions, right? In terms of the collaboration, right? Like this is a great example of at least beginning an ongoing conversation of what does a collaboration look like? How are we each kind of looking at the system and understanding how it doesn't work and then trying to rearrange it and flip it and invert it and yet still, be confident in our lane, right? Like we were talking earlier, collaboration is not just one person doing everything or just having that discussion. It's like, how do you put it in practice? And at least for anthropology, thinking about where the discipline came from and kind of being the lone person in a field versus thinking about, well, how do you take this deep understanding of a place, of a people, how they make meaning in their own lives and things like that, and translate and work with that and work with other people in different avenues, right? And use that just, to generate like new ideas and new ways of being or world building, like you're saying.
And I think it's interesting that you said, one of the outputs of the residency was a game. Because I find, one of the advantages we found from struggling to be creative during COVID and lockdowns and things like that was understanding how we could take advantage of digital solutions. So for example, I work on projects. I have a couple of projects that I'm working on in the City of London, which is a borough in London that's sort of the oldest section. And because it's got important heritage and a lot of value to it, they actually been quite progressive about looking at how culture plays a part in development and commercial development as well as residential, et cetera. And they're public consultation events. And very often, these public consultation events, when they're in person, and now when they're in person, they get maybe 150 or 200 people over a series of a couple of weeks or whatever. But during COVID, when they started doing finally digital consultation, the difference was that that same development would get, 3,250 engagements and responses. And there are ways in which people who can't leave their homes, can actually design through tools, online as well. And I think, one aspect is how we can really creatively embrace this sort of hybrid or cyborg, nature of how we're living now. And one good thing about that too, like connecting it to gaming and stuff, is you can make things fun. And so, it's okay actually to add some fun into very serious, solutions and, democratic tools and processes that we have. And so for me, I think one of those trends really is that there is going to be a lot more ways in which we are working positively as cyborgs to engage, which will enable us to include many more people. And I see that as a really positive trend. I think that artists progressively, a lot of the young creators are growing up working across different mediums and platforms. They're more confident in that. They don't feel so siloed. So the idea of opening up more opportunities for artists, I think we're going to have a lot more artists and a lot more artists with diverse practice and coming from diverse beginnings, able to actually see themselves as creatives, and as part of that. And so there's some very positive things that were sort of broken and then get to be reconstructed, due to that time. And I see it happening very, very quickly. And it's very encouraging to know that the democratic process can change, so fast. And those who have not been participating as much are the same group of people who probably feel most confident digitally. So it's a nice way that it starts to actually balance out.
You also mentioned, like breakdown and repair and care that's required, but that breakdown has consequences far beyond just us as human beings. So I'm wondering where you all also see this turn towards acknowledging like the environment and the more than human in these kinds of trends, and thinking about them as collaborators or whatever. So yeah, if you guys talk more about that.
Yeah, and I think it's also important. I mean, I find the binary discussion of is it good, is it bad, or is digital or analog better? Like we're so past that. We already live in this way that we're merged. So it is crucial. But there are those who feel more at home in their bodies and out in space or out in the outdoors, or other people who feel incredibly overwhelmed by that. And I guess it's leaving room for all of that to coexist and to understand that one isn't necessarily more important than the other. And so, yeah, I don't feel it needs to be one or the other. I don't know that there's any way in which we'd have the extreme of that. But yeah, we have to be conscious too that we used to think like, oh, well, we'll do it digitally and we won't use paper. But then the digital imprint has a significant environmental impact as well. So understanding, that total environmental footprint is rather crucial. And also if we're too separated, if our experiences are too virtual, then not encountering individuals face to face is an easier way not to feel like you have the same sort of responsibility for care. So yeah, I feel like it's got to be a big old mix, a melange of it. But again, that's another reason why I'm always drawn towards artists, because you can mix it up. You don't have to come up with a policy that says we'll only do this. There's the ability to seek out the different scales of engagement, different frequencies, different durations, and in that mix, you'll not only reach more people, you'll also have a much more sort of dynamic or diverse place or series of experiences, which ideally get us back to the sort of nature of hospitable and feeling home, and many more versions of home, so that people find that there is a time in which they can be most comfortable to engage.
I mean, I totally agree that it needs to be all of those things, and we can seamlessly kind of combine them. I think for me as an artist, I embrace, Instagram, which, I know a lot of people maybe hate it or whatever, but hey, that's like amazing to reach that many people like that, and it's a tool. I mean, you could misuse the tool or do dumb things with the tool, or you could do really great things with the tool. And I think it's about using everything we got. I love doing super, public, in the moment engagements with people, especially, post-COVID, when that's like, I still don't take this for granted that we can be in a room together, and just be with one another. It's kind of an amazing thing. And the fact that we could live stream it now, I mean, these are all like, we should be always doing that. Like, it's like leveling the playing field in a nice way. And again, like, yeah, they're tools. When I was in Kyrgyzstan, a lot of people didn't speak English, but I had Google Translate, and we would just sit around passing the phone back and forth, and we had these super meaningful conversations. And now I have a WhatsApp group with sanitation workers in Kyrgyzstan, and we text each other photos all the time. It's great. And, that wasn't happening 10 years ago, even, right? I mean, I don't know. It's all relatively new, and it's to me, it's exciting. It's just more possibilities, of engagement and bringing people together. And I love, I make books. Like, I like physical objects. I like analog stuff. I put out video cassettes not that long ago, But yeah, for me, we need it all, really, because all the issues and things that we're dealing with, it's all so multifaceted, And that's why I call myself a genre fluid artist. I don't want to be one genre. I just want to be able to use whatever makes the most sense at any given moment, you know.
Cady, feel free if you have another comment. We have some time left to open the discussion to questions or comments, input from the floor. So if anyone has questions, we also have some people online who are entering questions into the chat. But please feel free to raise any questions you'd like.
I can start with a question from an online chat. How can space be created, preserved, or reserved for spontaneous public art? And how can city leaders be convinced that this is a good and needed thing?
Sounds like my day job. You know, again, COVID was a really good example. You know, it was unfortunate. It also was a time where I said to all the Arts and Culture Network, mark this, like this is the best benchmark for you in the world, which is that all the images that people were posting, they equated with being dystopian, and it was because things weren't happening in those spaces. It's a little bit easier now. There's more of a belief that public space and design of it is demanded, is needed, and needs to be there. The how it happens and how it can happen for public art is a question. It's really important that artists and people who have cultural experience, those who actually know how art forms are practiced, how people create work, are involved in those processes. And you can always tell, artists can always tell, like theater makers can always tell if a theater has been made and somebody, and no one's been involved who's really understands how it works. So it's thinking, you need to think about not just images of what you've seen. You need professionals who understand the youngest members of the sector, what they're creating, what they'll continue to create, can start to anticipate it so that can be folded into the design. So like when I sit with architects and landscape architects, and they usually pull up images from the internet of what's happened or a case study that they like, that space was, you know, finished about 5 years ago. That means it was designed about 5 to 10 years ago. It means it was designed 5 or 10 years ago based on examples that were 5 or 10 years old. And so if you're not careful, you can get spaces that are outdated too quickly. And so, you know, it is important to have cultural professionals involved in those processes. To be able to work again collaboratively with the designers to think through the kind of things that could happen. And then the other thing that's become quite possible is it's either called meanwhile use, or, you know, I started a program called Preview, basically, which was like, how do you test out ideas? And you do it in space that isn't in great shape, and you allow different things to happen. And from that, you start to see patterns and what's necessary. And the work that I did at Times Square, every single project that I did was an experiment, basically, between artists and public space. And I've written about it a couple of places online, and there are some talks. And I need to continue to write about it more. But, you know, really, really understanding how you can try things out, watch how it happens. And again, you know, just that thing about the best design is left unfinished. Don't try and answer everything. But you also may need people to kickstart it. So another thing that very often I'll suggest in the sort of timeline of a development is have the first and most ambitious, not the safest, but the most ambitious and kind of interventions open that space. Set a standard of what you would like to see, because even if they're amateurs, they will want to rise to that, or they will want to compete with it and even make it better. So, you know, don't be too nervous. Always be very ambitious at that opening. That statement is kind of like the call to challenge, and also the call of invitation for people to use it.
Yes. You need to hire Sherry, because she knows what she's talking about. I echo all of that. I totally agree with. And I don't know, as an artist, I definitely appreciate when people have, really spoken with people who have experience, doing this kind of work and have spoken with artists. It certainly helps to have artists at the table, in the beginning stages, just as, advisors for these kinds of things. And really, know what you can afford to do and be realistic about your budget and pay the artists appropriately, and treat us, as we should be treated, which is as, real workers creating, something that we might not all know exactly what's going to happen, but we're going to work hard on making that thing a joyful, crazy thing. And public art is not just murals, also, I want to say. Nothing wrong with murals, but there's a lot of different ways to put art in your public sector. So
I think we have a couple of other questions.
When I was a city commissioner, I brazenly suggested that we have an ordinance where every public building has to have, I think, 1.5% of its value in art. And nothing is done now. There's no legislation. Political people, we have all of these strange buildings surrounding the university. There is no art in any of them. So, it's great to be creative and sensitive as the three of you are, and I admire you so much. But unless you get out there and do some campaigning, we're not going to have a beautiful city.
No, you're right. And again, there's the ability, if you want to know how to help make this happen, every time there's a public consultation about development, put your opinion forward. Because the reality is a lot of people don't. So, if even the number of people in this room answered the latest development and said, we'd like to be able to have public space that had public art, and I would like to be able to see concerts happen or whatever, well, that, sort of 50 people or whatever is going to be an overwhelming response. And then once it turns into a data point, it has to be addressed. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't happen on its own. It doesn't happen by magic. It is always in danger of being value engineered out. And so one way, for example, that I've been working is I always align it to public benefit. So a lot of planning process, they look at what is it that a development scheme can give of public benefit. And that can be sometimes it's a school, it's a hospital or whatever, but it's not so difficult actually to push in some money for art as well, because it's actually so much smaller than every other thing. It's always smaller than paving, or other elements. So, you can do it. And I'll just tell this really quickly, sorry. There was a scheme, and I was sitting in on a meeting, and I found out that part of the landscaping budget, like 2.25 million pounds, couldn't be spent on planting trees in this area because it wasn't deep enough for the roots. And I listened to the conversation go on for a while, and we got to the end, and they're like, "Oh, sorry, Sherry, we don't have much time for public art. Can you tell us, what do you think the budget's going to be for public art?" And I said, "It's going to be 2.25 million." And they're like, "Ah, ha, ha." And I said, "Well, you've got to meet that figure of public benefit. What better ideas do you have?" And so from that is how I was able to negotiate it. I didn't get the full amount, but I got 1.75 million, which was a lot more than like the provisional sort of 250,000 or something. So understanding and feeling confident also that is part of public benefit has been one of the best ways to ensure that it actually gets into planning obligations. And that's the key. It has to get into the planning obligations.
Another question.
Hi, sorry. Thank you for this conversation. I find it just very interesting. I'm a political scientist, but I'm very interested also in urban design and our relationship with the built environment, how it affects us. So all this talk about being in the world, meaning it's not only very experiential, but it's existential. And I think that's something that's overlooked a lot, especially by our policymakers. And so I have some meetings coming up with FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation, and you always get into this really bureaucratic realm about why we can't have places that mean something. And it comes down a lot of times to someone following a manual, which isn't always even, they're not always legally binding rules, they're recommendations. How do you, and this is to any of you, if you're an anthropologist, artist, whatever, how do you convey this idea to policymakers that what we build and how we inhabit the world matters? I mean, sometimes I think the best way to do that is to get a policymaker in an airplane and do a flyover and be like, this is why so many people have developmental issues or mental stress these days. Look where they grew up. How do you get this across to people? How do you frame it?
There are social value impact measurement tools that are being developed, some better than others, but I think you should look that up. There are ways then of being able to quantify when a particular scheme that is taken, has done the least amount of effort in creating a great environment, and those that have. And the easiest way to convey the message is to do a compare and contrast. What was spent, what is the value now, how do people feel about it, what are their perceptions? Social media is so great because you can get sense of if people value a space by how many images are taken in one particular location versus another. I think the easiest way to deal with that is really a compare and contrast. And then find as many ways as you can to make it quantifiable. Because the reality is that our world is more comfortable very often in quantifiable than or quantitative, right? Yeah, than qualitative. So that is one of the most effective tools that I've found to use. But how did you find it when you were having meetings on a weekly basis or something? Were there things that you put across that you felt like, oh, if in these discussions I can communicate some of these issues, it might impact something? It's did any of those, or do those opportunities help as well?
I don't know. if I feel like sometimes I'm just not at that conversation, unfortunately. You know what I mean? I don't get invited to that party. I'd like to.
Go to your civic association. I think that's part of it, right? So I live in Orlando. I have a house in Tampa. I'm kind of in weird places, but I joined the Tampa Civic Association for my neighborhood, and I dealt a lot with FDOT, as well as the city. And I think they have the manuals, right? I think a lot of it has to do with the way that you frame your argument. And I think a lot of it is about collaborations. Do you have a lawyer? Do you have a political scientist? Do you have an artist? And it's all these different ways in which you can frame the meaning or the value of something. I think the other thing though, is, working with your city, FDOT, federal, or the Florida department, they have different jurisdictions and can work at different scales. And so I do think a lot of it is showing up and having conversations, but also continuing to go over time. I know that's not really that helpful, but
it is, though, because it does encourage you to reach out. The other thing is reach out to the places that have done it well and call them up. I can't tell you, it's people who have been working on these projects for years, and to get somebody to phone you, and say, I think this is an incredible exemplar, and I wonder if it could help my city, and would you give me any hints or something? They will talk to you, and very often what you can do is find that you could have a peer-to-peer conversation. So then you could approach, your Department of Transportation and say, oh, I had this incredible conversation, with the Commissioner of Transportation in New York or whatever, and they said they would love to talk to you at any point if you want or something. And so sometimes I think what can be really crucial is allowing those who might feel slightly threatened to be able to talk to another peer who's going through it as well, can also be a great gift to them. And if they know that, they might be able to help. A lot of people might be beaten down by past bosses or different governments, administrations or something. You never know what's going on in someone's world. So give them the opportunity that maybe they actually wanted to do something better and maybe they're stuck and they don't quite know how.
And know their manual better than they do.
We have one more question.
Perfect. It's more of a comment, suggestion, and that is because art can be therapeutic. Like, I love art, but I'm more kind of old school. I like Van Gogh. I like, nature pieces. But you also have shock art, and especially families with little ones, having buildings set aside with a lot of shock art is not conducive to little eyes. So, but what I do find is that you have places like Japan that art is converted into pieces of like bonsai and nature and greenhouses and buildings that have more sustainable living and plants and kind of like a little garden. And why not implement more of that, which is a lot more therapeutic, into and incorporate that into the urban sprawl that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, there have been several developments where what I do is I pair artists with landscape architects so that they can create things together. So there are ways to think about that. And you're absolutely right. The context of not just the design context, but the social context of what's going to be going on around there, who's going to see the space most, who's going to walk past it most at different times of day, that always should be part of the consideration as to what the answer is, to that brief or to that commission. And if you put that in, context of a place, not just the site specifications and constraints, but the actual context, the history of the place, social history of the place, who's using it. Good artist briefs will have that. And also because that's very often what really excites an artist. They'll lock into a piece of that information and then they'll get very excited and then they create something, like you say, that can be therapeutic as well as beautiful.
There's absolutely a responsibility when you're making public art. And I totally agree that you can't just make it in a vacuum. Like it's in public, it's in a community, it's in a space, and that's all part of the process of making good public art, I think. So, I've just recently started a residency at the Botanical Garden in Queens, which is, I'm excited to see what happens there, but that's kind of like such a wonderful community space that they should have an artist there too, right? So it's exciting to see what's going to happen there.
Yeah, and just finally, my question earlier about like the more than human, I was really thinking more about urban natures, right? The fact that we're oriented away from a water body, like you've talked about, or focused on a building rather than the landscaping and such, and how to have more synergy there. And when we talk about hospitality and who's included, right? What kinds of other more than human bodies are part of that kind of urban ecosystem and such, and that's an ongoing conversation of how,
Yeah, and very often that can be considered, like wildlife corridors and such that, or transport, sort of what they call like creature transport routes or whatever, can be considered in line. And again, all of those things don't contradict where an artist is also interested. Any of those oddities or those challenges can become like great inspiration. And one thing that is important, though, that I have found is that not everybody feels comfortable in green space either. Some people grow up in more arid communities, and actually being in arid community makes them feel more calm. So again, I guess never assuming, that there's one answer for everybody, and understanding how, again, you come back to that context and the people who are there and the diversity of those kind of natural spaces as well as the build spaces are absolutely crucial.
I think we're going to continue the conversation upstairs where we have a reception. Please join me in thanking all of our participants for this really provocative and rich discussion. Thank you so much.